the third industry stakeholder breakfast meeting held by the CMTA. We are glad all of you are here despite your busy morning. To start off the event, let's look at what the CMTA has done to contribute to Sri Lanka and the industry. Next is a welcome address by our Vice Chairman, Mr. Andrew Pereira.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Chairman and the Executive Committee of the Ceylon Motor Traders Association, also known to all of us as the CMTA, it gives me a great pleasure and it's a privilege to welcome all of you to the third CMTA stakeholder meeting within the calendar year. Firstly, I take this opportunity to warmly welcome our chief guest this morning, His Excellency Mr. Denis Chaibi, the Ambassador of the European Union in Sri Lanka. Welcome, sir. We extend our gratitude and heartfelt appreciation to welcome Mr. Kotaro Katsuki, Deputy Head of Mission for the Japanese Embassy. Next, we welcome all the distinguished officials representing the government of Sri Lanka and the respective key ministries who are present here this morning. I would also like to welcome the officials representing our sponsors, HNB Leasing, Sri Lanka Insurance, SLT Mobitel, and AkzoNobel Paints, who have come forward to support the CMTA and all our activities. We welcome all the media partners present here today for assisting the association to continue to be the voice of the industry, and we look forward to your continuous support in all our future events. We welcome the founders, chairmen, managing directors, CEOs of the respective automotive brands who represent the manufacturers that are part of the CMTA membership. I also welcome my fellow executive committee members and the management committee of the CMTA. Finally, I welcome all the other invitees and guests who are present here this morning. So once again, we welcome all of you, and may all of you have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you.
Next is the address by the Chairman of the CMTA, Mr. Charaka Pereira. Charaka, please, if you could take the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The EU Ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, His Excellency Denis Chaibi, Deputy Head of Mission of the Japanese Embassy, Mr. Kotaro Katsuki, respected officials of the ministries and government institutes, invitees representing various stakeholder organizations, officials of sponsor companies, leaders of the motor industry, and my dear colleagues of CMTA. The first vehicle which came down to Sri Lanka was a European brand, a Rover automobile, which was brought down in 1902. European brands dominated our roads from that point onwards, and therefore the relationship between our motor industry and Europe goes over a century back. Because of that, actually, we are very much privileged and honored to have the EU Ambassador with us here today as a keynote speaker. On the 21st of July, the subject of vehicle import suspension was raised in Parliament. CMTA is thankful to Minister Madhuravithana for highlighting the job losses, the hardships faced by the industry, and for justifying the need for more vehicles in Sri Lanka, and especially for stating that the import suspension for two-wheelers was an unfair decision for the common man of our country. The State Minister of Finance, Honorable Ranjit Siambalapitiya, in his response stated that the government loss of revenue due to the vehicle import suspension was 620 billion for the period 2020 to 2023. And he also stated that the vehicles consumed only 4.69% of the total import bill in 2019. He also stated that the two-wheelers and commercial vehicles will be the first to be released. And we were delighted last night to see the Gazette opening up commercial vehicles, and we look forward for the opening up of the other vehicle categories as well sooner, hopefully. At the same time, as some of you are aware, the CMTA recently proposed to lift the import ban on vehicles with an increased additional import duty of 130%. And this is to be reduced by 15% every quarter. Under this scheme, we believe that the whole industry would require less than $400 million for the first year, as it is self-regulating. When analyzing the annual reports of the Finance Ministry and the Customs of Sri Lanka, it is quite evident that the motor industry tops the list for the highest return per dollar for the government. Therefore, CMTA points out that if vehicle imports are allowed under the proposed scheme, the government could be providing the much needed mobility for the masses and businesses while collecting more government revenue, much more than it gets from the product categories which have been opened in the recent past few weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, we see many exotic luxury vehicles being imported to the country under the migrant worker scheme, most of which are having exorbitantly high FOB prices and being retailed from around 30 million Sri Lankan rupees going up to about 150 million, and are being catered only to the affluent. A majority of these vehicles, the electric cars, do not have the backing of the global manufacturers. Hence, the manufacturer warranty and the recall facilities may not be available through the local agent. There are no spare parts for most of these vehicles if the agent does not import, and the country has to spend a substantial amount of forex to stock spares for these models, which is not the case with conventional units. Further, we hear news about an impending power shortage of power generation for the next 6 months, which is also going to get escalated with an influx of EVs as we go on. Considering all the challenging aspects of such EVs, CMTA proposes to include plug-in hybrids, and petrol vehicles to the migrant worker scheme. That would actually benefit the majority segment of migrant workers, as such vehicles are well accepted by the masses and have much lesser negative aspects to the country, while most key spare parts are already available in the market. Continuing on the topic of EVs, while CMTA understands the need to achieve the agreed decarbonization targets as a country, we would like to note that many other countries also have agreed to the targets at COP26. While some of these countries have far better EV infrastructure than Sri Lanka, none of them have set their targets for 100% passenger EVs for the immediate term. This indicates that all of them understand the impracticality in achieving 100% passenger EVs even within a span of 5 years. Further, I'd like to quote the below section from the UN website, which clearly states the conditions agreed at COP26. Quote, over 30 countries, 6 major vehicle manufacturers, and other actors like cities set out their determination for all new car and van sales to be zero-emission vehicles by 2040 globally and 2035 in leading markets, accelerating the decarbonization of road transport, which currently accounts for about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Unquote. The above clearly states that the global target for 100% new passenger EV sales to be 2040, while leading markets to achieve it by 2035. I wish to highlight that this refers only to car and van sales, and there is no mention of two-wheelers having to be EVs even by 2035. The FOB of a passenger electric car is about 40% higher than the petrol version, and the high voltage battery is nearly 50% of the FOB of the complete vehicle. Most developed countries which have made progress on electric passenger vehicles have done so with the government incentives, heavy incentives. Hence, switching to EV now would add more pressure on the forex outflow of our country, as well as the government revenue. Therefore, while CMTA agrees that the future of mobility will be electric, we propose that Sri Lanka aligns its passenger electric vehicle policy with the rest of the developing countries and plan the roadmap to achieve 100% new electric cars from 2035 and not before. However, CMTA would like to congratulate the Ministry of Transport and the Sri Lanka Transport Board for taking steps to gradually convert the public transport to electric, which is certainly a step in the right direction. and one which has been taken by many developing countries. Electric mobility on passenger transport results in more people being transported in a fewer vehicles with lesser environmental pollution. Further, it is easier to regulate it, unlike passenger vehicles. CMTA also appreciates the efforts taken by the Ministry of Industries, Ministry of Environment, the Industrial Development Board, the Ministry of Transport, and the PUCSL to regulate the EV imports as well as the vehicle industry itself, which should set the foundation for a sustainable motor industry in the future. In my view, a developed country should be where the public transport system is convenient and comfortable enough to be used by the wealthy, while basic cars and bikes should be affordable enough for the common man to purchase. Your Excellency, EU is the second largest trading partner of Sri Lanka, and the EU has provided substantial grants over the last 2 decades on many sectors such as post-tsunami reconstruction, assistance to conflict-affected people, sanitation, hygiene, and humanitarian aid. You arrived in Sri Lanka towards the end of 2019 and was here during the most difficult period of our country in its recent history. But amidst these hardships, it is amazing to see the contribution the EU delegation has made to our country during your stewardship, and therefore we are quite saddened to understand that you will be moving out of our country soon. Projects such as the Pico Trail, the Community Livelihood and Biodiversity Recovery Initiative, and the iWeather in Hospitality are unique programs which are self-sustainable and would tremendously improve Sri Lanka tourism while providing the much-needed foreign revenue to our country. The growth of tourism will certainly increase the need for mobility, which will be a boon for all our members. Your Excellency, the automobile industry in EU has evolved way ahead of most parts of the world, and countries like ours look towards the EU to understand the future trends of mobility. Mobility as a service, or MaaS as it's commonly known, has taken well off in EU, and the public-private partnerships such as MaaS Alliance supports the sustainable growth of MaaS by linking all service providers. MaaS fulfills users' needs for mobility with a wide range of transport services for both passenger and goods, offering tailor-made transport on demand. A MaaS service provider arranges the most suitable transportation means to meet the customer's needs, whether it's public transport, taxi, car rental, or even ride sharing, car sharing, or bike sharing. Hence, this could be an area where the EU could support Sri Lanka, which would have multiple advantages to our country as well. Further, electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles are also having a substantial growth in EU, as many countries in Europe have the required infrastructure, legal procedures, support services, and a higher percentage of renewable energy. These are also areas which advice and support from EU could be of immense advantage to all of us. Finally, on behalf of the CMTA members, I would like to request your support for the CMTA proposal to lift the vehicle import suspension, which is not only throttling the motor industry and our members, but also impacting the overall mobility and our economy of our country. Thank you. May you all have a pleasant morning.
Thank you, Charaka. That was rather insightful and also practically looking at the future of Sri Lanka mobility and how we could adapt the great policies which are set forward in the European Union. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite our Senior Vice Chairman, Mr. Virandi Zoisa, who would introduce our guest speaker, His Excellency, the Ambassador for the European Union, Mr. Denis Chaibi.
Good morning, everyone. Please let me take a few minutes to introduce His Excellency Denis Chaibi, the current EU Ambassador to Sri Lanka and Maldives. He started his career in the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1993 and went on to the Embassy of Madrid and moved to the European Union, where he spent a number of years working on trade issues, specializing on China and high-profile investigations involving the US, Japan, and other trade giants. His next assignment was Deputy Head of EU Delegation in Nicosia during the EU-Cyprus accession negotiations and the Annan Plan put forward by the UN to solve the Cyprus dispute. In 2004, he was appointed as the Assistant European Correspondent, focusing on the European Commission's input in the EU's common foreign and security policy covering the Middle East and Asia. This was followed by a stint at the EU delegation in Washington before coming back to work for the Vice President of the European Commission as a senior member and Deputy Chief of Staff. His Excellency came back to wider Middle East issues by organizing the first Brussels Conference on Syria in 2017. Soon appointed as the head of task force in Iran in EU, in charge of coordinating the work of the international community regarding the implementation of the nuclear deal with Iran. In parallel to his administrative career, His Excellency continued to teach and write, in addition to courses given at Brussels Free University, Boston University, Cyprus Institutions, and Yale. His Excellency has degrees in law, political science, European studies, international law, and an LLM from Cambridge University. In Sri Lanka, His Excellency has played a pivotal role in the ongoing trade negotiations relating to GSP+. He has been instrumental in continuing the grants, not loans, offered to Sri Lanka, supporting developmental projects with over 1 billion euros in grants received over the past 2 decades. His Excellency commenced a 4-year partnership with the Ministry of Justice with funding of 18 million euros to digitize, systemize, to improve efficiency, transparency, and accountability of the justice service delivery in Sri Lanka. And most recently was part of one of Sri Lanka's most exciting tourism attractions, the Pico Trails, which we trust will be an unforgettable and novel introduction to the Sri Lankan experience. We are truly honored by your presence here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in inviting His Excellency to the podium.
So, many gentlemen, a few ladies, good morning. Let me say from the outset that I think the country would do better with more women in charge of key posting. So I always start like that because I often address a room in which there are far more men than women, but I know that in the car industry it is something that is customary. But anyway, it is an honor for me to be here. Obviously, when Chairman Chanaka told me that the Indian High Commissioner and the Japanese Ambassador had been here, it was an offer I could not refuse, even if it's my last days in Colombo. So I'm very honored to come after 2 prestigious colleagues who I've watched the videos, and I know that their sessions were very good. So I hope you have more realistic expectations regarding the EU, and that you will forgive me for my lack of knowledge of the car industry. But I think it's very important that you invite people who are not from the car industry. It is a key moment in the industry. You are going through the most important mutation of your industry in the last 70 years or 80 years. And it is a mutation that is not only linked to, technology or companies or something. It is much more than that. And that's why I think it's very important to have discussions on big picture, on society, on movement that are happening in society. And in Europe, we have obviously a vibrant automobile industry. And, the first message that I'd like to pass on the role of the European automobile industry is that over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a shift. In Europe, and I suspect perhaps in other parts of the world, until the 90s or even beginning of 2000, the car industry in Europe had more influence over the politicians than the politicians had over the car industry. What do I mean? I mean that if big automobile manufacturer in Europe would come to the government and say, look, we have X million of people employed in the industry, and to sustain that, we need you to build more roads and more parkings in the center of cities and to have direct access into the cities and things, the politicians would follow that. If now such proposals would be made, the politicians would just say, no, we're going to lose votes. That's not how we're going to operate. And this idea that the employment that you provide cannot be replaced is no longer true. So it is a huge shift in Europe, because once the automobile industry has less influence over politicians than politicians have over them, then the rationale of the industry changes. So it is a shift in the industry, and it is the first time in Europe that the automobile industry influence is receding rather than increasing. So this requires a change of mentality. And you know, in every industry where you have a major shift, it's very hard for the people who have been in industry for a long time to shift their rationale. And it's very, very difficult for the European automobile industry to start to have alliances with other actors in mobility, especially in IT. It is very difficult because they have to reconsider the way that profits will be shared and how policies will be made. So in Europe, you know, it would have been very, very natural for someone outside the sector, if you were the automobile industry at the beginning of the 2000s, to buy IT providers. You know, no major European automobile company has bought a massive app or you know, a key IT supplier, whereas it is the future. It's one of the track for the future of the industry, but the mentality, the approach was not there. So another thing that is a major shift is, and that's for younger people, is that people who are, let's say, younger than 35 in Europe don't consider mobility as something that is driven by a good, by something material. So they are looking at the service, not at all at the good. What do I mean? I mean that before, people for my generation, or perhaps also other generations, you know, one of the key in life was, with your first salaries and things, to save and buy a car. You know, in an American talk show, you have often the interviewer asking to a famous actor or something, what did you do with your first check? They all bought a car. They all bought a fancy car. All the people who got to celebrity status when they got money, they bought a car. The new younger crowd, no, they don't buy a car. They are looking at mobility as a service, not as a good. They don't want to invest in a good. They want to have the easiness and the facility of pushing a button and then being transported. So the automobile industry is moving from being more a service than a good, and putting sustainability about individuality. So it looks more, what is key for the service is to be sustainable rather than cater for the individual. So these are major shifts that are happening in Europe. And if one wants to use IT terms, since it's the future of mobility, I would use mobility 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Not that they are coming in successive fashion, they are interacting and overlapping at some stage, but they help to focus the mind on what's happening. So the first mobility 1.0 in Europe, it's car-centric. It's still car-centric, but it's about cleaner car, connected cars. If you want, it's driven by Tesla and the way it's approaching the car market. It's driven by Uber. Is the fact that the car remains at the center of mobility, but in a cleaner way and more linked to the IT. So it's electric energy, it's service providing. So this is what most of the focus is now in Europe in terms of implementation. Mobility 1.0, tech-driven, car-centric. But there's something else happening already. It's mobility 2.0, which is city-centric. And it is amazing the impact that the cities have had on mobility in Europe. So this also embraces emerging mobility technologies, but it's marked by more leadership by the cities to shape the mobility ecosystem. So basically, the cities are limiting the number of licenses that can be offered, for parkings, for circulation. So there's a limit. It doesn't allow, not everyone can own a car. It costs much more. There are far more constraints. It has to be linked to services. It has to be linked to objectives, environmental objectives. And it puts much more emphasis, for example, on passenger vehicles that are for mass transportation rather than individual. So there it's still, there are still cars, but it's far more limited. It's not open to everyone. There are far more constraints. And there's a goal that is, full of rules. And this is not for the entire world. It's working in Europe because we have large cities, very, very densely populated, very rich, with highly educated people who are keen to embrace this more environmental approach to mobility. And there's a strong political power in those cities by these people. So like in many hyper-democracies, we have a relatively small number of people, but who are very vocal about a cause, and they transform that into a political objective and manage to mobilize the entire political system for this goal. So in Europe, it's, I would say, not more than 25%, 30% maximum of the people in the cities who want this mobility 2.0, but they manage to get into the cities the mayorship or the person responsible for mobility, and then they come with very, very strict measures. So for example, in Paris, Madrid, Brussels, it's simply impossible to go into the center of the city without an electric car. It's simply impossible. It's impossible to park in the center. And there are many, many things like that. And that prefigures what is the mobility 3.0, which is planet-centric. And there basically it's to do away with cars in cities. That is the mobility 3.0. It is about having mass public transit available to everyone. So a very, very strong public transit system, very cheap, and then trains for connecting cities to cities. And then the last mile solution is about, electric soft bicycle that you can share, scooters, this kind of things. But this is really going very far. It's really absolutely no cars in center of cities, and it's even the urbanism is about what we call the 15-minute city, so that any individual should have most of the services, work, little groceries and things within 15 minutes, either walk or transit system. So this is a concept that is spreading fast in Europe because young people love this concept of the 15-minute city and no cars, meaning that you can walk and cycle almost everywhere. I don't think that we are here in Sri Lanka close to mobility 3.0, but I think it's important for you to understand the kind of movement that is happening in Europe. It's not happening everywhere in the world. As I said, you need very densely populated area, you need political will, you need very good mass transit system. So that's the overall big picture. Now, in terms of electric cars, because that's, I think, the most interesting thing for you. As it has been mentioned, in Europe we are promoting this very actively through different measures. It has been, this shift towards electric vehicles has been driven by a collective commitment to reduce carbon emissions. But in all transparency, but don't quote me too much on that, it's interesting to see that the electric cars movement, first of all, was not fully embraced by the major European manufacturers until quite recently. And still now, if you look at the first manufacturer of cars in the world, Toyota, you will see that the electric vehicle is not the main track of development for Toyota. Volkswagen has decided to go for it, but even now, as we speak, has scaled down the production of the ID4 and the ID line, despite having some success. So it is a delicate situation, because if you look at figures, you can see that the sales of electric vehicles is booming in Europe overall. So in 2019, when I left Europe, the sales of electric cars among new cars was 1.9%. That was 2019. How much it is now in Europe? It's 25%. So it moved from basically 2% to 25% in 4 years. So that is a massive jump. But as I said, Volkswagen, Toyota have not been at the forefront of that effort. So I think it's interesting for you to reflect on what is happening. On the one hand, you have massive jump in the mentality of customers, but on the other hand, the main actors are not there yet. Why would Toyota and Volkswagen not be fully on the electric? I mean, Toyota less than Volkswagen. It is very hard. I don't think it's the same reason for Toyota than for Volkswagen. But I think once again you have an approach where when you are the leader of the market, you think you know better and you have more difficulties to adapt. I don't think that Volkswagen or Toyota will be the Kodak of tomorrow. That Kodak never adapted to the digital imaging transformation, not at all. But I think that they seeing the problems that are linked to moving to electrical vehicles fast, they see these problems and therefore they're trying to manage the situation in terms of investment, in terms of progress, with a very strong sense of a timeline. Because the way the things are going, the winners in the electric vehicles are clearly Tesla and BYD, the Chinese companies. Their cars are more advanced technologically in terms of electric vehicles. They propose a kind of different model, and they can afford to have a price war. So if you look at what has happened over the last year, Volkswagen went, as I said, much more aggressive on the electric cars. They've started to roll out and invest their ID line. And what Tesla has done is to lower their price to the price of the Volkswagen, making it very difficult for Volkswagen to compete. So what I'm saying is the electric vehicle market is really at the beginning of the maneuvers now that you start to have competition to Tesla. The Chinese distribution of BYD is still not strong in Europe, which means that they have not been factored in the competition, but it's going to come one way or another, and that's going to be a very, very tough competition because China has invested massively in batteries, and therefore they have a competitive advantage in terms of supply chains and manufacturing costs. So we're going to have a serious adaptation issue. And this is just one of the small issue. The second main issue is how do you incentivize this? So in Europe, there are really lots of incentives to move to the electric cars, and in other parts of the world as well. We have first the one that is the most controversial, which is subsidies for manufacturers. Everyone wants to attract the next factory of electric vehicles and offer large subsidies. But when subsidies become so large that they totally disrupt competition, has been the object of tense discussions between Europe and the US, because the US has put forward a package that basically tries to attract all the manufacturers of electric cars in the world to their place. So this is a first massive issue. The way the things are going, there will be a very limited number of big winners of the moving to electric vehicles and a lot of losers in terms of employment. Another thing is tax break for the owners. So for example, in Europe, many countries have said that any company car, which are totally depreciated by the turnover of the company for which the person works, so basically only the electric cars could be company cars. So this has, propped up. So that's why also we move from 2% to 25%, because that is basically the market share of company cars in some countries. So this has been things. But the biggest challenge or public expenditure is obviously the infrastructure, recharging sites, and there we have a serious issue. Filling a tank with gas is 2 minutes. The best recharging station, if you put it on massive things, is it takes at least 20 minutes to get to the 80%. So even if you have a electric station that brings 20 recharging things, which is a big footprint, you will have only 20 cars for 20 minutes. So the financing of infrastructure of recharging is something that people say, oh yes, it has to be developed and we will adapt. But it is a massive challenge. And what is even more of a challenge is the grid. For the grid to be able to support that, you need massive investments. So just to give you an example, in the country I come from, Belgium. So Belgium proposed massive incentives at the beginning of 2000 for the people to install solar panels. And so at that time, everyone could install solar panels and get money back if they were consuming less than they were giving back to the grid. It was too successful. So at some stage, they could not be paid. It was a neutral operation. They had a tax break or they didn't have to consume, but at least now anyone, even with a solar panel, has to pay close to $500-600 a year just to maintain the grid, just for the grid to exist, even if you don't consume 1 watt. Why that? Because maintaining a grid and ensuring that the grid can receive and redistribute electricity from renewable energy requires massive investment. And basically, if the car industry was to move to electric very quickly, it would basically double the strain on the grid. So just, to move to 0 to 30% over 20 years, we had to ask every consumer to put up a lot of money. If we want to move very fast to the electric cars, and the objective is to move within 10 years, we would have to triple that investment that has been made. So, if we look at this picture, what does it mean for Sri Lanka? Basically, the 4 things that are driving the move to electric vehicles. So I know that I've underlined the difficulties, but as I said, in Europe it's moving fast. We are at 25% and it's going to keep moving. But in Europe, the way we are moving to electric vehicles is first through strong regulation. We have very strong regulation, but a regulation that remains very clear for everyone. The objective of moving to electric vehicles by 2035 has been very clear for some years. There's been some tweaks over the last few months, but it's only about the kind of fuel that can be considered biofuel. Having said that, I'm pretty sure that the battle between those who want to prolong the life of combustion vehicle is not over. And it will keep on, as if the infrastructure lags behind, if the difficulties I have highlighted do not get resolved, there will be more and more political discussions on how to prolong the combustion engine. But at least the regulation as it stands is very clear, 2035, a very ambitious goal. But then the thing that really made the manufacturers and the people switch was the enforcement of regulation. It's not so much the regulation, but the enforcement. And there was really, I think, a change in the mind of the industry. In 2013-14, the US gave the biggest fine to an auto manufacturers for the Dieselgate in the US. I had bought one of these Golf diesel in the States, and I never got my money back, thanks to the arcane US system. But those engines are fantastic, but they are not according to the rules. And the fact that for the first time with one of the biggest company on earth, an administration went after it, really made the people change. So the enforcement of regulation is key to push the people to move to electric vehicles. The third big factor is the profit that Tesla has made per car. You know, an electric car costs 50% more than the equivalent model in Europe. You know, a combustion engine, a Golf that is nice with a couple of trims and things would cost around $30,000. A Tesla Y, it was 60, now it's 45, or 55, 45. But basically, an electric car, ID4 or Tesla Y, is 45, so 50% more. So there's more profit because there's also less maintenance for the company, generally less because there's less friction, less operations to do in the first 2 years of warranty. So anyway, the profit per unit has been bigger than for combustion engine, and this has also been a motivation for the car industry to push for electric car. And the fourth element, as I mentioned, the infrastructure. Europe has reinforced its grid, it has multiplied the recharging thing. So for Sri Lanka, in this drive, we have to, I think, look at these basic things: regulation, enforcement, profit, but profit not only for manufacturers or for you, but also for the state, because import duties are quite a component of the state treasury, and infrastructure. And all this is a very moving environment, because, as I said, the biggest potential actor, China, BYD, has not managed to really go into the world yet. But when they go, it will have an impact on the overall automobile industry. So what we are doing in Europe is, for all this regulation enforcement, we are looking at something with predictability, coherence, and consistency, which should be the case for any regulation. So for predictability, it is essential. It is essential that you and the transportation ministry sit down together and have an idea of how you're going to go about this policy. You need to have impact assessment. You need to have stakeholders consultation. A first draft, the draft has to be reviewed once it is tested, and then some discussion during adoption. And then the implementation phase has to be really spread over time so that you can adapt. Otherwise, there would be many dead along the roads, because adaptation that is very fast for something that provides so much employment would be terrible. The second thing is, this legal framework has to be coherent with the big picture. You cannot have tax breaks for electric vehicles if the overall result is a shortcoming in the treasury at the time where you need more infrastructure for recharging things. And the country being bankrupt, there's simply no money available for infrastructure investment at the moment. Once the country gets out of default, which we hope would be soon, then there's perhaps access to green finance. But if access to green finance is conditional to many, many criteria. So any legal framework has to look at the big picture in terms of revenues, in terms of taxation system, in terms of overall environmental goals and the energy mix and your infrastructure of the grid. And then what is very, very important for Sri Lanka overall, because all this needs investment, is consistency. Once this has been done, it cannot be changed every 6 months. It cannot be changed every time there's a new minister or a new secretary. This is the best remedy to not have access to green finance. It has to be consistent and stay like this. So it's better to take a bit of time before putting the regulation in place, and better to do it in consensual manner with your association, rather than have it quickly because we have to do something for electric vehicles, but then change it 1 year later. That would be so detrimental for the future of the car industry. So it has to be, this kind of things has to be a partnership. It has to be a partnership between the private companies, you here, the government, but also, you know, the gas or electric station that will come. You know, there's been just an opening now about competition. The competition has to be part of this discussion. And one has to really look at the timeline. And in terms of timeline, and I'm not being paid by the chairman, but in terms of timeline, it's clear that hybrid vehicles offer a way to test the policy, to look at what can be done, to experiment with the tax breaks, without having, you know, a massive revolution, because at least, you know, you still have lots of people who are employed and could look at the combustion part of the hybrid things. Another thing is you have to build up, and that's a key factor, you have to build up the expertise on electric vehicles. And as you said, and again, not paid by the German, but public transportation is really public transportation in the wide sense. It's going to be very difficult to reform the bus system, even though having driven 4 years here, I can tell you that's the one thing that needs to be reformed. To drive in the mountains during the rain, in a storm, by night with buses is one of the scariest things I've done in my life. And if you look at the number of accidents even over the last few months, you will see that the toll has been thing. So reform of the bus system is very important, but to move to electric buses would require, or gas, hydrogen, these kind of things would require massive investment, which I think are not there. But you can pave the way for, at some stage, have a path. But something that is really a low-hanging fruit is to make sure that there are incentives, and really good incentives for tuk-tuk to go electric. With good donors, this is a no-brainer. It's a small capacity. It's perfect for the kind of traffic, 0 to 30 kilometers an hour, start and stop. Possibility to have the tuk-tuk charging overnight. Again, because of the grid, because of the constraints, something that has to be gradual, but it's an excellent way to build expertise in electric engines and things at a small cost and with scalability. So hybrid vehicles, public transportation, tuk-tuks are a way to experiment and to do that. Because at the end of the day, whatever you do in the future of Sri Lanka, employment and added value has to be at the forefront. You have to recover economically fast. And for that, employment is essential. So any transition has to really make sure that employment in Sri Lanka is kept and can grow and adapt very quickly. Thank you very much. I'm happy now to take questions and comments about the EU in Sri Lanka.
That was a very holistic and a rather insightful few minutes for us. Thank you very much for that. And now the Q&A session will be assisted by Yasendra Amrasinghe, who is our immediate past president. Questions will be taken from the audience. There will be two gentlemen with microphones who will be walking around. So if you could get their attention, you could direct your questions to His Excellency, the Ambassador. Thank you very much. Over to you, Yasendra.
Thank you, Taranka. And thank you, Ambassador, for taking the time to be with us today and for your insightful address. You did mention that you didn't know much about the auto industry, but you would have fooled us because you sounded like an expert. So one thing, just a small correction to Viran's introduction, whereas you did start your diplomatic career 30 years ago at the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you actually started your career as a water skiing instructor, I believe. You've had a long and illustrious career dealing with quite challenging subjects as a diplomat. First of all, if I can ask you, what's the drive behind the diplomatic services? What does it mean to you?
In what sense?
Personally, what is the passion for you to be a diplomat?
It's the best job in the world. You know, you paid to discover countries, to make new friends, to visit. In the case of Sri Lanka, an island of wonders. What not to like? It's simply the best job in the world.
Absolutely, thank you. If we move on to the EU initiatives, and particularly under your tenure, in 2021, the EU announced the signing of 3 grants worth 36 million euros, and the majority of this, 18 million euros, was focusing on providing capacity development and technical assistance, specifically regards to the judicial sector. If you can kind of give us an update on what has been the progress on this initiative?
Yep, so perhaps I can give an overall picture of EU to Sri Lanka. So first of all, the biggest donor to Sri Lanka historically is Japan. Japan has been the provider of the biggest overseas development aid to Sri Lanka. And then second comes the EU with grants. Obviously, India played a huge role very recently with 4 billion, but this is a treasury operation. So the EU since the 90s, has provided more than €1 billion grants, all grants, to Sri Lanka. Between 2014 and 2020, we committed, which means that we are still implementing, and that's part of that, 200 million euro grants. And now we are in the phase of 21-27. So this money that was committed in 19 and in 20 was signed in 21. So we try to have impact with the EU taxpayers' money. We're trying to have actions that change either society or the perception of Sri Lanka abroad or these kind of things. So Sri Lanka has many institutions, and I think it's a wealth for the country, the fact that there are so many associations, institutions. It is really a highly civilized, refined country with a very strong administration. And in this administration, we feel that judges are very important. Sometimes, having been in Sri Lanka, we've seen that the judges, for the impact that they have and their potential to improve everything, relations between individuals, relations between business, do not have enough support. Do not have enough support in infrastructure, do not have enough support in training, and then sometimes do not have political support. For the political support, we cannot do much, but the rest we are trying, because we feel that stronger judges will be very good for Sri Lankan society. So what we've done is set up a program with the UNDP, UN agency, and UNICEF, to train judges, to digitalize court, to make access to justice easier, especially for women. So basically, we are trying to encourage lawyers to have consultations that can help the people to have access. As I said, we are training judges. We are having long discussions with the Ministry of Justice. The Ministry of Justice is very cooperative, very supportive of this initiative. So we really hope to have an impact on society at large.
Thank you, and that sounds like it's a very deep and broad-reaching initiative. Moving on to the hot topic of electrification. Now you did mention that Toyota had kind of taken a backseat from jumping into the deep end of electrification. So what we believe is that Toyota has taken a strategic decision on this, as I've seen on other manufacturers jump in head first. Whereas they've realized that not everyone wants an electric vehicle, and they've catered to that percentage of the market who doesn't. And you did mention the other product lines in terms of hybrids and also in terms of public transport. How do you see in our current policy context, where it's very much favored towards immediate electrification, how do you see our current trajectory and any amendments that should be made?
In Sri Lanka, I think I will revert to what I said. You need to sit down and have a very long vision, long term, that bears in mind the constraints that you have. Sri Lanka, as I said, Sri Lanka won't have the money to invest in infrastructure of grid overnight. It needs to have a very sequenced approach in terms of what is the infrastructure needed, once the infrastructure needed is identified, how do we fill the gap? Connecting to India and have an integrated energy market may be one solution, but that's for Sri Lanka to decide. To find more sources of renewable should be feasible. For many things, Sri Lanka is blessed. So including not only for the best food in the world or the best scenery or the most beautiful landscape, but in renewable energy, Sri Lanka is blessed. It has mountains, which means that mountains and rain, which means that hydropower is easy. It has wind. You have lots of shores with strong winds. You have sun. You have 300 days of sun a year minimum. And you have tides. I mean, Sri Lanka, with about 15 to 20 billion dollars investment, could be carbon neutral in a few years. All electricity produced in Sri Lanka could be carbon neutral in a few years with 15 to 20 billion dollars investment. this is a blessing, and this could have an impact on electrification. But the problem is to have access to that green finance, because that only makes sense if you have concessional terms for these loans. If you have to pay market things, it's going to be very hard to recoup within 5-10 years. So that's why there has to be an analysis of what is needed infrastructure, how this can be financed, and then to have a timeline on how this translates into a greener mobility, but part of a wider picture of a green transition for Sri Lanka.
Definitely. And the EU has gone considerably further ahead than Sri Lanka in that journey of electrification, not just of the transport sector, but in terms of producing green energy. What would the EU be able to provide Sri Lanka in terms of learnings from their successes as well as the missteps in terms of policy specifically on how we could go in the future?
Well, the first lesson is not about the finance or the things. It's political. When you are shifting from combustion engine or more hydrocarbon to electric, it's political because there's a shift. So there are winners and losers. Not everyone adapts, and you need to have a critical mass of people who are ready to change the way they are living, the way they live. And you know that it seems natural. It's not at all. It's not at all. In France, the start of the big protest called Gilets jaunes was because people raised the price of diesel in a way that was to finance electrification. And basically diesel is purchased by people from middle class, and they felt that, and rightly so, they felt that the electric vehicles were for the upper class. And why did they have to finance, the owner of diesel, the lifestyle of the richer people? And it caused massive havoc in France for 30 weekends in a row. But the first big lesson is when you have a transition, a green transition, you need to have a critical mass of people who support this. And that's very difficult. It is simply very difficult. And even in Europe, we are still at a minority of people who want to have this change, but this minority is more vocal in the political system, so it gives a political mobilization. But for example, and again, in a very transparent manner, the EU as a commission, as executive, was chosen 4 years ago, it's a mandate of 5 years, on the basis of a Green Deal. So the EU said, we're going to have a Green Deal, and there were like 20 measures. One of these measures was to reorient land affectation. Basically, when you're above use of land for more than 30% for agriculture, environmentally, it's a problem because you don't have enough capacity to absorb carbon. So 4 years ago, the leader of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who is from center-right, said, this is the Green Deal, this is my program, and she was supported by center-right. Now, in the last few months, the biggest political movement in Netherlands has become the farmers, who are against this reaffectation of land. In turn, they mobilized Europeans, and when finally this bill, which had been announced 4 years ago, which has been prepared for 4 years with, as I said, stakeholder consultation impact, it came, the center-right grouping, which is the biggest in the European Parliament, mobilized to not vote it. So even things that were you could take for certain and granted were questioned. In the end, the coalition of Greens, Socialists, and all that managed to overcome this reluctance of the center-right. But what I'm saying is, you're going to have a shift. You need to have the support of the people. And I don't think at this stage in Sri Lanka that there's a critical mass of people who are ready to change their lifestyle in order to finance green. And then after that, you have all the things that I've mentioned, the infrastructure, the incentives, the capacity to do that, and access to finance. But the first one is political.
Political and also psychological, I suppose. And in Europe, I suppose it would have been easier considering the urbanization, the high level of urbanization in some countries.
So urbanization is clearly something. And also education, not in the sense that people going to university, but realization of the green imperative It is very much in the news all the time in Europe. People see with forest fires, with drought and things. I mean, I was just in the south, and it's the first time in 4 years that I see all the ponds and the things dry. So there is drought here. But for example, in Spain, it's moving to desertification. So Spain was my first posting. 30 years later, all the south of Madrid is basically becoming a desert. So for Europeans, the forest fire, the heat this summer, these kind of things make it much more realistic. So people are mentally moving faster to the need to adapt to greener policies.
Absolutely. If we look at the upcoming trends, you did mention things like mobility as a service and ride sharing. Considering again that these tend to be benefiting the more urbanized areas, Sri Lanka has a 19% roughly urbanization of the population. What do you feel that the these trends have significantly benefited in the EU in terms of sustainability and reducing urban congestion, or has there been any pushback, and especially in terms of, I suppose, last mile transport outside of cities?
One is to see, but in Europe, with the way things are moving, it is very impressive. So, for example, I'll speak about the examples I know best, but in Brussels, what has been the fastest increase of mobility over the last 5 years? It is walking. So usually, let's say 5-10 years ago, walking was 2% of the mobility in cities, and now it's above 10-15%. Public transportation has doubled, so people are making an effort and sacrificing kind of comfort, and they do it happily. They see a lot of advantage, and we have far less cars. But to get there, the Brussels authorities, so once again I'm talking about the city-centric, they made the life impossible for drivers. It's really hell to drive into Brussels. It's really hell. You're going to spend 45 minutes stuck on the outside of the city.
Intentional, or was it?
Yeah, it is intentional. It's a war. I was part of the commission at some stage working for the vice president, and I had to do some administrative affairs, and it was clear. They were declaring war on cars in cities, and it is the same in Paris. It is the same in many cities. I mean, the congestion charge in London, the way it is expanding, makes it very, very difficult for some people. If it's the center, obviously it's natural. But when you get a bit more to the outskirts and the urbanism is built over the car, you have an individual house with an individual garage, then you cannot have that. But the first bus is 20 minutes away, and then the bus goes to a tube station. So basically, you get into the center of London after 1 hour. It is so. There are some benefits for the people who can adapt, but there are also, for old people, for people with kids, it requires much more planning for European cities. So yeah, the urbanization factor is a key element, and I'm not sure exactly if the discussion is over, because we can see that there's a tension there. But what is clear is that the municipalities, the cities, and not only the big capitals, even the smaller ones, have played a huge role in shaping mobility. They are really taking full advantage of the powers they have as cities to shape mobility. And that's also an important thing, because when you're going to determine mobility for the country, you'll have to compose with the power of the cities. And the cities, in Europe, they are, and even in the US, they are exerting this power with a lot of aggressivity, or let's say assertiveness.
Definitely. Now you mentioned that access to green lines of funding would be critical for updating infrastructure and moving forward if we are to grow and develop as a nation. You did mention the white elephant of policy stability. What are the key aspects that the EU would like to see being implemented or changed from where we are now in terms of where we should be in the future?
I mean, as EU, we don't want, things specific. We hope can simply deliver on its potential. The city has a huge the country has a huge potential. It is really well placed. It has a very educated workforce. It is beautiful. It has so many things to offer. But for that, as I said, the right economic choices have to be made, the stability, the consistency. So it's not that we want some things to see, but what I can say, an example to support Sri Lankan efforts, and it's Sri Lankan decisions, but it's public finance management. When was it? 7 years ago in the programming, we did something with the World Bank, and the World Bank proposed 30 million loans to Sri Lanka, and we proposed 10 million grants to do public finance management. So basically to equip the Treasury, the Central Bank with more tools for audits, for governance and these kind of things. When the economic situation started to turn bad, the previous administration said we cannot have a loan. The EU grant was conditional to the loan, so we managed through administrative procedure to save those 10 million euro, and the project is now starting. So for example, we have World Bank specialists now working in the Treasury on how to improve the audits and the transparency of public finance management. This is one example of, I think, can benefit Sri Lanka, but there are many others in terms of policy and choices that one can put forward.
Excellent. That's an excellent initiative. Now, if we look at specific programs related to more towards the auto sector, you did mention the low-hanging fruit. One of the low-hanging fruits was electrification of three-wheelers. Would there be any specific kind of programs that would assist in not just this electrification of tuk-tuks, but this kind of sustainability transformation? Would there be any EU-specific programs?
So the EU has two main themes for its programming of the overall grants funding for 21-27. The first theme is a peaceful and inclusive society, so it's social aspects and these kind of things, which includes local governance. And then the other one is green recovery. So it's green recovery in which energy is not properly defined, but one could think about it. In green recovery, we are starting now with food waste and recycling because of the food situation in the country. There are 10,000 households who are in difficulties. There's been a disruption of fertilizer, so we mobilized at the peak of the crisis 4 million euro to buy fertilizer and bring it with the FAO. So we're going to do more action with the FAO on vegetable gardens, this kind of things, food security. That's one form of green recovery, but we could look at something more ambitious. But I think the difficulty is that you have how many tuk-tuks in Sri Lanka? More than 1 million? 1.2, huh? So 1.2 million tuk-tuk, that makes a lot of vested interest. Not only because there are perhaps 2 drivers per tuk-tuk, it's not only the 2.4 million drivers, but all the mechanics, all the people financing the purchase of the tuk-tuk, all the people of the spare parts and all that. That's a lot of vested interest. And if they don't understand what's in for them in the electric shift, they won't support that. And you need their support to move that. But if there was a clear framework saying this is the plan and we're going to implement it and we're going to enforce it, and these are the numbers that allow for the people to pay over time so that they don't suffer economically from it. If you come with such a good plan that is realistic and well thought through, and I think that over time with leasing and all that, there's a possibility of retrofitting that over time, then I think that the money will not be the problem. USAID, Japan, EU, we have all banks and things that can do concessional loans at very interesting possibility. If it was, for example, I'm putting my colleague on the spot, but if you have a good LRT project that is connected to the tuk-tuk and that you have an app that allows you to take the LRT and for the last mile the tuk-tuk that is electric and you have one combined ticket, this is the kind of things that really help in programming and developing a much better mobility for Colombo. There was a release of where you lose the most time in traffic jam, and Colombo was very high, which here in this small center we don't suffer, but if you're at the end of Bataramula or Rajaria and you try to pass the bridge at 7:45, 8 a.m. or so there are ways, but for that you need planning, you need the numbers, you need a proper stakeholders consultation and assessment. But as I said, you start with 2.2 million people to convince, and that's a tough tall order.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned multimodal transport in terms of having something like a unified ticketing system. Is there something we could look to in Europe as a case study, as a paradigm and what to reference?
In all the center of Europe, all the approach is multimodal. If you go Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, I mean, all the ports, all the train station, all the things are multimodal. You have parking, you have trains going straight to the port seamlessly. It's all integrated. It's all Belgium. Once again, the country I come from is just a huge logistic center because it's between France, UK, and Germany. And so all along the highways, you have a dense highways, but you have warehouses along the highways with train from the other side, and everything is connected to ports and main center of sorting out that whole area is just an example of integration of multimodal things. Netherlands, the ports, Rotterdam is the master plan of ports in the world.
So there's a wealth of experience there that Sri Lanka could draw on. Ambassador, moving on to trade, the EU is a significant market for Sri Lankan exports. It's actually the second largest with 22%. Can you kind of provide an overview on the current opportunities for Sri Lankan manufacturers, and also in terms of the GSP Plus, which is set to run out this year and has been proposed for another 4-year extension? Where do you see the stance now and the importance for it in the future for Sri Lanka?
Mm-hmm. So let's start with GSP Plus. So a GSP Plus regulation lasts 10 years. And then, so every 10 years you have a regulation. So the current regulation ends on the 31st of December. The idea was to have a new regulation, and it has to be negotiated between the member states, so the council, the parliament, and the commission. So the executive, the legislative, and the kind of senate. And they haven't found an agreement. They haven't found an agreement because of differences on how to deal with migration, with death penalty, and this kind of things. So because there's no alternative, the Commission has proposed to prolong the current regulation for another 4 years. Perhaps it will not be 4 years, it will be less than that, but it puts pressure on the negotiators to find a solution. What does it mean for Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka will see the next report of the GSP Plus, which is for all countries. So this report should come out in October. So the report will either recommend the suspension of GSP Plus for countries or not. If it recommends the suspension, it goes to a debate in the parliament. If not, things continue as they are until the next report, which is in 2 years. So the things continue with the same logic. So that's for GSP Plus. More generally in trade, Sri Lanka has to have, as for a green transition, a strategy, because Sri Lanka is 22 million inhabitants, so it doesn't have a huge domestic market. So people will not invest here for the domestic market or to have an endless reservoir of workers. And the problem is South Asia is one of the least integrated regions in the world in terms of trade. And Sri Lanka is not part of FTAs with that are ambitious. There's an FTA with Singapore, now an FTA being negotiated with Thailand, but it's not part of a very deep FTA. What does it mean? It means that Sri Lanka at the moment has market access because of GSP Plus, but if it gets out of the economic crisis, it will graduate. It will move above the threshold to continue benefiting. So that could be in 6 years, 7 years. But once it's out of GSP Plus, Sri Lanka will not be in a position to have market access through trade agreements, whereas the natural competitors now of Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and others are have more market access. So if Sri Lanka doesn't have the same market access that it has now, it has really to think about how it's going to trade. Does it have to be more through services and go much more on services? Does it have to go through bilateral partners who have these FTA, like India or others, or Thailand? But one way or another, Sri Lanka has to start thinking about a strategy for its future beyond 6-7 years in terms of trade, because at the moment the strategy relies on elements that will no longer be valid in 6-7 years, whereas the rest of the world is moving fast.
Absolutely. So it's critical for us to be thinking of this and thinking ahead. Ambassador, before I throw over to the audience for questions, I'd like to ask the hot question that everyone is waiting to hear your response to, and that is that the government, the IMF required the government to submit in last June the plans to release all of the import suspensions. However, so far as regards to vehicles, they've only indicated for commercial vehicles that it would be renewed, perhaps for released for motorcycles perhaps next year, and no word on passenger cars. What is the EU stance on this trade embargo after 3.5 years, and what are the recommendations to that, or what would you hope that the government would be doing in this regard?
Once again, I've not been paid by the chairman, but we've been very unhappy about this for some time. We've raised this in the WTO, and actually Japan was part of the discussion. So we raised it in the WTO. The Sri Lankan government offered one explanation in terms of forex that has been discussed. We are not harassing the authorities because the country is in default and we can see the issues, but I think as the chairman identified a possible solution, there are ways to allow for the import of cars without forex flight, as long as you find the treasury mechanism to pay the duty that guarantees that. So it's about finding the right policy rather than operating a blanket opposition. We've made this point several times very clear in the beginning of the previous administration. For this one, I think it's only natural to see how the country gets out of default and then restart the discussion how this can be implemented. The member states are more at the forefront. I mean, it's a EU competence, trade overall, but the commercial interest of certain companies is more defended by member states.
Yeah, thank you for giving a lot of sentiments about Sri Lanka. But I just want to ask you now, supporting the judicial system in Sri Lanka, is that you think that it is, and you told about the public finance management as well, is it something about, if I directly pitch on it, it's corruption that matters or the present situation? That's what you think as outside, first to keep in line or put it right. That's what you are supporting the Sri Lanka.
So you want me to lose my job as a diplomat? Look, no, but corruption. First of all, corruption is universal. There's corruption everywhere. It depends how sophisticated it is. In Europe, we have regularly scandals of corruption. Scandal is, it's universal, but and you don't change a system where there's a lot of corruption overnight. The things that are key, and I think will be, the IMF will release a report on governance in Sri Lanka in September. So I warmly recommend the reading of that report if you want to have a good idea of what can be done. But the first thing is the media. The way to report corruption is very important. And sometimes there's a vibrant freedom of expression in Sri Lanka for certain matters. But there have been reports of big scandals. but I think that there's room for more reporting. And I feel that sometimes, I don't know if it's a self-censorship or if it's more a lack of interest, but I feel that there could be more reporting. But I guess that there's a reason why people don't report as much as they could. So that's the first thing, the reporting. The second thing is the action of bringing litigation, so the people who would have an interest in doing that. And the third, indeed, is the independence of the judges. Strong judges are a very good tool for better governance. It's not the main driver of our action, to be totally transparent. We want to favor the step before, which is access to justice. Our key objective with this URE is access to justice. But we hope that through access to justice and the judges having cases which are not just hampered by the backlog and that they have, but that they have more times and better training to look at that, they will be stronger. If you, and it's a bit controversial, but I'm leaving soon, so I can speak more freely. You know, one thing that we as EU have said a lot of things over the last 4 years is the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And we haven't discussed that as, you know, people in Geneva telling Sri Lanka what human rights should be. This has not been our approach. Our approach has been that we could see in Sri Lanka that the majority of the population found this system of PTA arbitrary and not fair. We could see that there's a majority. So we spoke for the majority of Sri Lankan about PTA because we felt we could speak about that, because Sri Lanka committed to reform the PTA when it asked for GSP Plus reinstatement in 2017. It was a formal condition to get GSP Plus back. The government committed to say we will reform PTA. So because they took that commitment, nobody forced Sri Lanka to take that commitment. It was the sovereign decision of Sri Lanka in order to have market access to the EU. So they decided that, so that allowed us to speak about it, saying this is a commitment you took. We want to discuss that with you. But once again, we are not telling what Sri Lanka should do. We are saying if a majority of the people want a better, fairer system, this is something that we are happy to work with you through conditionality of market access or expertise support through the UNDP and things. So that has been the overall approach of our action.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency, and for being here to provide you with a token of appreciation for your time taken to honor us. I would invite Sharaka Pereira as well as Viran Dizoiza, our Vice President.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ceylon Motor Traders Association, it gives me great pleasure to propose the vote of thanks at the end of a very successful breakfast meeting. Firstly, I take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude and appreciation to our eminent guest speaker, the EU Ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, His Excellency Denis Chaibi, for accepting our invitation and for gracing this event with your presence. Your Excellency, thank you for your insightful and thought-provoking words. This morning, and we hope the EU delegation continue to work closely with our country and strengthen the ties between Sri Lanka and the EU. We extend our gratitude and heartfelt appreciation to Mr. Katauro Katsuki of the Japanese Embassy and all the officials representing key ministries and government institutions for taking time off your busy schedule to be present here. We believe you will continue to work closely with the CMTA in building a national framework and policy for the automobile industry. I also would like to thank and acknowledge the officials representing all our stakeholder organizations for being present here today. Thank you for engaging with the CMTA on various ongoing projects. that will help impact the industry in a positive manner. I also would like to take a moment to personally thank our sponsors, HNB Leasing, Sri Lanka Insurance, AkzoNobel Paints, and SLT Mobitel. Thank you for coming forward to partner CMTA on all our events during these challenging times. Without your generous sponsorships, this event would have been an uphill task. We thank all media partners present here today who have helped the CMTA throughout the years. The founders, chairmen, managing directors, and CEOs of respective CMTA member companies who represent manufacturers. Thank you for being present today and your guidance and direction provided as industry leaders. I also would like to acknowledge and thank EXCO members and management committee of the CMTA for your commitment and hard work behind the scenes on behalf of this 100-year-old association. Finally, Jake Hilton and the staff for your patience and accommodating all our requests in making this event a success. Once again, thank you for your presence this morning. I would like to now invite you for a second breakfast if required and some fellowship. Thank you very much.